Okay, let's get started here. My name is Chaz Hutchins. I work with Anderson Perry and Associates. Uh, Currently, I serve as the city engineer for the city of Hermiston. So I've done quite a bit of work with them over the last 5 years. Um, Prior to that, I've got about 15 years in the experience in the engineering sector. Prior to that, I did a lot of stream restoration type projects, fish ladders, and so forth. I wanted to talk today about water meter reading technology that's available. And a lot of what I talk about today will be based on a project that we did for the city of Hermiston back in 2017, where we replaced all of their endpoints on their water meters and then replaced a bulk majority of their water meters. And so a lot of what I talk about today will be based on some of the lessons learned from that particular project. One of the main purposes of my presentation today is to talk about the logistics that are involved in doing a water meter replacement project. And then also comparing and contrasting, cellular read type endpoints, versus like a radio read or maybe a fixed base type reading system, and go from there. So first of all, I think we're all fairly familiar with the different types of technology that are out there for meter reading. It seems that starting out, everybody was manual reading. This is obviously several years back, but started out with manual read systems, and then there's the touch read systems that are out there that were popular for a while, and then more recently, and probably the most common type of meter reading type technology out there is the radio read, whether it be drive-by or handheld, or where you have to walk and just get in close proximity to the water meter, and then it picks up the signal. In talking with some of the manufacturers for water meters, it seems to be the radio read systems seem to be the most common that are out there right now. Another type of system is a fixed base system, where you have collectors positioned in certain parts of town that pick up the signal from the water meters, and then it can either be downloaded from the collector or it can be relayed to a central location to read the data. The one that the city of Hermiston elected to implement in their system was a cellular read type technology. And so, like I said, I want to talk about that particular case study and kind of what we did for the city of Hermiston, and then we'll compare and contrast that type of system versus some of the other ones that are out there. So, going to open up a couple of things here. Hopefully the technology works like it should here. I thought, given the flooding that had occurred this spring, I thought this was kind of funny. I came across this about water meters, and so I thought that kind of applied, especially to Eastern Oregon with the flooding we've been having. I thought that kind of was ironic. So, starting off here, City of Hermiston in 2017 did a water meter upgrade on all of their water meters, and it was an interesting project to be a part of. It was quite an undertaking. The city has roughly 5,000 water meters, and so as you can imagine, there's some logistics that play into updating that many water meters. The city was utilizing predominantly they were using radio read type of technology, with also some of it was walk by, some was drive by. Anyways, so that was the kind of the they had about 1,700 meters that had the radio read in it. So there was still some touch read going on. So they kind of had a hybrid type system happening at the time that we decided to do this project. So before the project even began, there were several things that had to happen. The city met with different distributors of water meters to decide, what was going to be the best. They kind of felt like, if they were going to make a change in where they were getting their water meters, that now would probably be the best time, because after this project, all of their water meters were going to be of a certain manufacturer. And so the city met with they predominantly had been using Badger meters and had been working with them quite a bit. And we looked at different options, other manufacturers that were out there, and it was decided that they wanted to stick with the Badger meter company. And I'm not promoting them, it's just who they used. So one of the things that the city had to do, because they decided that they were going to purchase all of the water meters, all of the endpoints, any registers that they needed, and any setters ahead of time, and that the contractor, whoever they hired to do the work, was just going to install the meters. And so before the project even began, they basically were going to purchase approximately about $1 million worth of water meter equipment. And so, as many of you know, there's logistics involved with that and sole sourcing. And so what the city did was they sent out a notice, and we published it in the, hang on a second, let me get this to full page here. So what they did is they had to send out this notice, and they published it in a couple of different places, one being the local newspaper, and I can't remember if we ran this in the DJC, the Daily Journal of Commerce, or not, but essentially what it says is that we have a good reason, the city had a good reason to sole source, and that we kind of made our case for why we wanted to do that. The big one was 1/3 of the total in-place meter inventory consisted of Badger read radio meters, and the majority of the remaining 2/3 were Badger manual read meters. And so updating all the meters to Badger with the Orion cellular endpoints was the most cost effective for the city. And so they kind of made their case and basically said, if you have any if there's anyone that wanted to protest the sole source, that they needed to contact the city and let them know about it. We did not get any protests during that process, and so it made it easier to go ahead and contract with Badger Meter and get those meters ordered. So some of the other things that we had to do ahead of time was to figure out where to store roughly 5,000, let's call it 5,000 meters. And so the city happened to have a big storage container, and I can't remember if they had to rent another one or not. They might have had to rent another one. And so once all the meters showed up, they stored them in it was an outside storage container. And let's see here, so once they had all that in place, they put that under lock and key. Obviously, there are a lot of valuable meters in there, and the next thing that we had to figure out was how we were going to logistically keep track of which meters had been done, which ones hadn't been done, and what that process was going to look like. And so we came up with a spreadsheet that I'm showing here. And this information is not as important as the labels across the top. And so what we did is each meter had an account. So we took the city's existing system and downloaded it into an Excel spreadsheet to make sure that we had every meter in the system accounted for. These read routes were they weren't really important, but it was something the city had in there in the sequence. Just the name, last name, location ID. Each of the existing meters had a location ID and an address associated with that with the lat long. So we had all of the old information in there for the meters, and then we also wanted to cross-reference that with the new register that was going in there, because the way that you can imagine that when you replace the existing meter with an old one, we needed to know what the reading was when we took it out, and so that they knew how many gallons they had used. And then once we put the new one in, obviously that was going to start registering. And so for that next month's bill, it was important to know kind of where the old one left off and where the new one began. So we had the new meter. Every one of them had a new register number. They were all Badger meter, and we recorded which model was being installed, the size of it, gallons register, when it was installed, date installed, and then and I'll get into this here a little bit, but whether or not a setter was installed with it, and whether or not the endpoint was installed under the lid, and if it was a confined space entry. So I'll kind of get into some of these points a little bit later, and what the city was trying to accomplish with this. One of the other things that was important to know is what the city was starting out with, and so we had to come. And some of it was the city had a pretty good idea of what they had in place, but they were unsure about a few of their meters and what size they were, and so there was a little bit of estimating involved in that process. But for the most part, we were able to nail down what the city had, and I think you'll find, we'll show you the bid schedule and then the total, the actual, and it's pretty close. We were pretty happy with how close we estimated those amounts. One of the things that we had to consider in this process was, logistically where to start and how that might play into when certain residents were being built. And so the city essentially, we broke the city into 4 different quadrants, and so here's kind of how the city was broken out. They had 4 sets, and so basically the city bills every week, and so they would bill the blue one week, and then the next week the purple, and then green, and yellow. And so what we tried to do was focus on a certain area and get all the meters replaced in that read area, and then move on to the next one, just to keep on the accounting side of things. As the city was sending out bills, they knew where the contractor was working, and so that was an important piece to figure out and include in the bid, so that the contractor knew that, hey, he can't just do a random install pattern here. He needs to do set 1, then set 2, set 3, set 4. So that's how it was broken out. So that was kind of some of the pre-project setup, if you will, and some of the logistics that had to be done. After that, we got into the design, and the design was actually pretty straightforward and simple. Basically, we looked to see there are basically 3 components to the water meter setup. there was the water meter itself, and whether or not it was compatible with the new technology, and then the endpoints. We knew that we were going to have to replace all the endpoints because we needed them all to be cellular read, and so there was that part, and then there was also the meter setter, and whether or not there was one in there or not. If there wasn't a meter setter in there, the city wanted to make sure while we were in there messing with things to go ahead and install those setters, and so that was the basically the three components that we looked at. We only really had one figure as far as drawings go, and I'm showing that here. Let me zoom out just a little bit here. So, like I said, you had the endpoint, you got the meter itself, and then the hardware there. And so one of the things that we had to figure out is just kind of what the distribution was between, which meters had setters, or which boxes had setters in them. And so again, without going out and looking at every single one, there was some estimation that had to occur in that regard. All right. As far as specifications go, we really only had two sections. We had this water meter section, and the meter setters and the water meters were being provided by the city, so there was really no materials involved with that. And then we wanted to make sure we spelled out what the execution of that installation looked like, and what we wanted them to do with the old meters. If there were fittings that were not quite compatible with the new meters, we wanted to make sure it was clear, who was going to be providing those parts and miscellaneous items, so that it was very clear to the contractor what he would need to supply and what the city was going to supply. So that part of the project was pretty straightforward. We just had, like I say, with the ones specification with the figure and that water meter reading map that I just showed you, and then the measurement payment, which is pretty straightforward. Another thing, I'm gonna move over here to the bid schedule here because I think it helps talk about what some of the other considerations were. So as you can see, we had some cellular endpoints that had the existing register was actually had a radio read, so that register was compatible with these new endpoints, and so in those particular cases we just had to provide an endpoint only. Whereas on some of the other ones, all the manual read ones, we had to actually replace the register and sometimes the meter. And so this was a breakdown of all the different work items for the project. We had some 3/4 inch water meters and the endpoint. So we had just some endpoints, the water meter and endpoints, and then the water meter endpoint and the setter. So we had 3/4 inch, 1 inch, 1.5, 2, and so on. So that was a consideration. Also, what the city wanted to do is they realized that with this, and I'll talk about this later, but one of the things with the cellular read, if you mount the cellular read endpoint underneath a metal lid, then sometimes that signal doesn't get through, and so that was a consideration. And so a lot of some of the water meter lids already had holes drilled in them, and so we just had to pop that endpoint through that hole and screw it on. But some of them were had a solid metal lid, and so we actually had to consider drilling a hole. As you can see here, drill a hole in the pit lid to receive the cellular endpoint. And so the city wasn't sure if they were going to have the money to have the contractor do that part of it, and so they put that as a bid alternate. And then also while we were at each water meter, since we were going to be touching every single water meter the city had, we wanted to check for insulation in that water meter box, and if there wasn't any in there, to put it in there. So that was another bid alternate, because the city wasn't quite sure if they were going to have the funds to be able to do that or not. But it was something that was desirable by the city. Another thing that is not shown on here, but it was described in the specifications, is the city wanted to be able to, while they were at the site and while they were touching each one of the meters, is to go ahead and shoot them in from a GIS standpoint and inventory all of the meters and where they're at. So we wanted sub-meter accuracy on those water meters. And so as part of the contract, the contractor was responsible for collecting a GPS point for each one of those water meters, and then providing a shape file to the city with the location of every single one of their water meters that they could then import into their GIS system, so that they had a pretty accurate location, like say sub-meter, of where all those boxes and meter boxes were, which the city would consider to be very valuable, when there's snow on the ground, or if one gets buried by a resident owner, they would be able to go out there and still be able to find where those meters are. One of the other things that was considered too was we were worried about a property owner claiming that there had been damage done to the surrounding area where these guys are working. And so what we required was that the contractor take a picture of the area before they went on site, and then when they were done, take a picture of the inside the box of the water meter, and then also the surrounding area, just in case there was ever a claim. We could show that, hey, this is what it was like when we showed up, and this is what it was like when we left, so there was no arguments about what the pre-project condition was there. In just to kind of fast forward a little bit, we actually didn't have any of those, which the city was elated that we didn't have any issues in that regard. One of the things that we didn't consider that ended up being a change order on this was confined space consideration. Obviously, the contractor on those confined space had to provide a little extra equipment for dealing with confined space, and so you'll notice here when I show you the final pay app that we actually had a line item in here for each size of water meter. I don't think there was any 3/4 1 inch, but some of the other ones, there was some confined space considerations that weren't factored in. So that's something to think about. So we did the project, and I just wanted to show you, we only had 2 bidders on the project. One was the National Meter and Automation, and then GT Excavation. And so you can kind of see, rough prices for installation of those meters. Your 3/4 inch ones, if it was just the meter and the endpoint, $50. But if you had to do the setter, it's $125, and so on. So you can kind of get a feel for the costs associated with that. As far as drilling a hole in the lids and insulating the box, we felt fortunate that the low bidder on the project, the cost wasn't significant on that part, and so we went ahead and awarded that bid alternate for doing that. Okay, so as far as pre-construction goes, I'm going to go back to the spreadsheet that I had open just a minute ago. We had to get this spreadsheet to the contractor, and then there was a process in place where weekly the contractor would submit an updated spreadsheet to the person at the city that was in charge of billings, and she was keeping track of all the meters that were installed to date. And so that gave us a really accurate number of when it came to application for payment. We had a spreadsheet set up. We knew exactly which ones had gone in. If there were any calls, she would be able to look at that account ID number and be able to talk with the person calling in and answer any questions that they might have. One of the things that we didn't really think about at first, but in the pre-construction meeting, the topic came up was, if we didn't have any signs on the vehicles that were pulling up to people's homes and installing the water meters, we thought we could get some pretty irate landowners. And so even though we were sending out notices and other things, we thought that it would be prudent to have some kind of a magnet or some kind of a decal on the vehicles that were being used by the contractor that essentially said something about, hey, this is part of a city project. And then each one of the employees also had a thing around their neck, a little badge that, if anybody came out, they could show them that badge and say, hey, we're working on behalf of the city. Here's our credentials, essentially. So one of the other things that we did that we kind of had in place pre-construction-wise was we did some door knockers. So we hung little flyers on people's doors about a week before the construction was to occur on their particular meter. This was in addition to the city sending out information in the bill, their monthly bill, utility bill, prior to the project beginning. That got sent out to all of the users, and then about a week, about a week before we went out and did the actual work on their particular street or on their particular meter, we hung a thing on their door letting them know that we'd be coming by. This was all really helpful, and like I was saying before, really kind of headed off any potential miscommunications or somebody showing up on somebody's property unannounced. I felt like throughout the project that things went really smoothly, and that we didn't really have any altercations with landowners or any of the users that were upset because we were doing a project on their, or fiddling around with their meter and getting this new technology in place. So those are all things to consider. One of the other things that we did that we had to figure out ahead of time was how we were going to inventory and keep a good track of all of the water meters and endpoints that the city had purchased, and how these were going to be divvied out to the contractor. And so the city came up, they got a scanner, almost kind of like one you'd see in a grocery store, where the contractor would come every day and check out a certain number of water meters and endpoints for what they thought they would get done that day. And so they'd scan them, and then at the end of the day they'd reconcile that with the ones that they installed versus the ones that were left over, and so then that would go back into the enclosure, and that way the city could account for every water meter that was leaving their possession. And so that was an important piece to consider and to get set up from the get-go. And again, I thought that really went smooth, and we didn't have any unaccounted for water meters, which was great. So moving on to construction, the construction process took about 3 to 4 months, and there was some. The actual construction took 3 to 4 months. There was some follow-up stuff at the end where there were some of the endpoints that weren't reporting. They were trying to get to a 98-99% read rate on those endpoints, and so when it was all said and done, I think they were about 95 or 96, and so there was some troubleshooting that was going on, and each one they call it waking the water meter up. They had a little bit of issues here and there with some individual water meters kind of getting woken up, and at the same time they were updating some of the software. And so anyway, there's a little bit of back and forth at the end that kind of drug the project out a little bit longer than we were hoping, but for the most part, after 3 or 4 months, all the meters had been installed. All of them had the holes drilled in them. The final application for payment, I just wanted to show you that. So here was the overall cost. We're in that $295,000 range, and I think we mentioned this before, but wait a second, let me get this so I can rotate my screen. So like I said before, we had a couple of change orders. One was because of the confined space, so we added some line items in here for confined space. But overall, we were able to insulate all the water meter boxes, drill a hole in the metal lids, and overall felt really good about our overall cost for getting all these installed. Like I say, there was a little bit of change order for confined space, and then at the end of the day, the plasma cutter and the welder and generator and compressor, the contractor wanted to know if the city wanted that, and so there was a little change order for them purchasing that from the contractor. So that's it for kind of the construction process and the bidding process and kind of the overall project. I wanted to kind of switch gears here and start talking about contrasting these cellular endpoints with other types of technology that's out there. So as most of you are probably aware, there's several different types of ways to read meters. As I mentioned earlier, there was the majority of the city's water meters were actually being read manually. They had about 1,700 meters that were the radio read type of a meter reading system technology that was being used. And so you kind of have the manual read, you have the touch read. But in talking with manufacturers about this, by and far the most common type of water meter technology, water meter reading technology that's available out there is the radio read meters. And it sends out what they call an RF signal. It's constantly sending that out, and whether you're driving by or walking by with a handheld unit that communicates with that meter, once you get in range of that RF signal, then it collects the information, puts it onto either a handheld or a laptop or whatever you're using. And then once you get back to the mothership, if you will, where all the information is being recorded, once you get a Wi-Fi signal with that laptop or that handheld unit, then it picks up the information and downloads it so that you can get that out and look at the information and send bills out and so forth. It does require, the radio read requires some hardware and some software. There is some of that associated with it. The rough costs on that, just talking to a couple different manufacturers, between the hardware and the software, you're usually in that $1,200 per year. And so for a really small system, it might not pencil out to be cheaper to go that route. If you had just a few, say you had 1,000 units out there, that's over $1 per unit. And so I'll talk about the costs of the cellular endpoints, but you have to spread that cost at $1,200 per year out over your meters. So if you don't have very many, it might not pencil out to be the most cost effective. In addition to the hardware and the software, there's also right around a 9 to 10 cent per endpoint charge for those radio read meters. And so just be aware of that. If you are considering switching to a radio read meter system, you're going to have a monthly charge there of right around 9 to 10 cents per month per endpoint on that. Another fairly common technology that's available in the industry is the fixed base system. It is it has a collector, which is basically like the equivalent of a cell phone tower, where depending on your topography, you could have one collector, you could have multiple collectors throughout your system. Anyways, they need line of sight and need to be able to communicate with that endpoint, and so you have all these endpoints scattered out throughout your system, and they're sending a signal, a similar signal as the radio read to this antenna, and then that antenna, you can either go to that spot and collect the data, or you can also have the antennas sending the information to kind of a home base where you're collecting all of the information that's being transmitted. Typically, those towers and those antennas are maintained by a municipality, and so if you have your own infrastructure that you can mount the antennas and stuff on, obviously that's the better way to go. If you have to put it on somebody else's infrastructure, oftentimes there's a rent cost associated with that. Or if you have to acquire land and put up your own tower, obviously that would be something to consider when you're trying to decide whether or not to go with a fixed base type of technology. And like I was saying before, the topology of your city and how it's laid out can play a factor in that. If you have a lot of valleys and high points, trying to collect signals from those low points especially is difficult. And so sometimes like I was saying before, it requires that you have multiple collectors so that each endpoint can communicate with an antenna on that collector. In talking with some of the water meter suppliers out there, usually your fixed base, you're getting a reading about every hour, and so it's sending information on about an hourly basis, and so that's just something and I'll compare that with the cellular here in just a second. The monthly cost on a fixed base is right in around the 28 to 30 cents per endpoint, and so it's about 3 times the cost of a radio read system. Obviously, on a fixed base, you have the cost of the antenna and maintaining the infrastructure associated with that, which would need to be factored in, but just the cost to the supplier to operate and maintain their system is 28 cents per month per endpoint. So something to be aware of. So moving on to the cellular endpoint technology, it's similar to a fixed base type of system. The signal that it's using is an LTE signal, which is the same signal that a cell phone would use, a typical cell phone would use. So in the city's case, it's collecting a water meter reading every 15 minutes and kind of storing it in the endpoint, and then one time per day it sends this information to City Hall, where they're collecting the data for all of the endpoints. There's no infrastructure associated with this type of system. When I say there's no infrastructure, I mean there's no infrastructure that a municipality would be tasked with maintaining. They're essentially using cell phone towers that are out there and being maintained by the cell phone companies. And so your Verizon, AT&T, Sprint, all those different cell phone companies, they have towers and associated infrastructure, and so you're essentially using their antennas and they're maintaining it, and if something happens, they're going out and fixing it. And so it's a nice it's a nice option to not have to worry about going out and maintaining that infrastructure associated with it. Typically, when you lose your cell phone coverage, or if there's power outage or whatever, cell phones are one of the first things that are up and running, just from an emergency standpoint. And so it is a fairly, I'd say, pretty reliable signal. And so you wouldn't expect to have a long period of time where you're out of coverage with your, communicating with your endpoints. One of the nice things too about the cell phone, the cellular read system, is that it's all cloud-based and it's web-based, and so as long as you have access to the internet, you can access your information. And so this is good from the standpoint of I'll talk about this here in just a second, but each individual user in the system can download an app onto their phone. And like I said, as long as they have cell phone coverage and have access to the internet in some way, they can take a look at their data because it's all out on the cloud and they can access it at any time, which is nice from the standpoint of they're getting not real-time data, but it's very close. They can go onto their device today and see what water they'd used up until yesterday, and so that's nice to get that quick feedback on your water use. One of the things that has been really helpful in that regard is as far as leak detection goes, it's been very useful for the city to be able to see when there's potential leaks and notify customers in a quick and efficient way. And I'll talk about that here in just a little bit when I start talking about this app that the city has that you can download onto a cell phone. One of the big savings for the city of Hermiston anyway was it was taking about, on average, 1.5 full-time employees to be able to go out and read meters. They were that was their job, 7 or 5 days a week, all day, every day, going out, and they just had, like I say, on average 1.5 full-time employees tasked with going and collecting water meter data. And so by installing the cellular read system, it freed up some man hours for them needing. They were talking about maybe hiring somebody else to come in and help them because they were getting behind on some of their day-to-day operation and maintenance. And by putting in this system, it freed up some man hours to then allow them to go out and help the crews with operating and maintaining the system. One of the drawbacks of a cellular read system is that, and this might be the case with other systems as well, I'm not sure, but whenever you have a metal lid and you mount that endpoint underneath the metal lid, you have trouble getting a good reading on that endpoint, and so that metal interferes with the signal, and so it's best to have a composite or a plastic type of lid, and then just have the endpoint screwed up to the underside of that. So that's the preferred lid type, is a composite or a plastic. The city had several, they had, just looking at this here, they had almost 3,300 lids that were metal that they had to be drilled. And so On the metal lids, you can make it work, but you just have to drill a hole through it and then thread your endpoint up through it, and then put a little black cap on it so that endpoint is exposed to sending out that system. It's ideal to have the endpoint sticking up above the lid 1 to 2 inches, but that's just not practical in a lot of cases because you get they're in lawns and a mower would just chop that thing to pieces. And so for the city, I think most of theirs that they put in, they were half inch or less above the lid, the part that was sticking out of the endpoint. So anyway, that's just something to keep in mind when you're considering this, is how many metal lids, and there was a cost associated with drilling those and getting them set up for the cellular endpoints. The cost on the cellular endpoints is 89 cents per month per endpoint, so right in that 90-cent range. So again, it's about 3 times the cost of a fixed base type of technology, but it does include all of your tech support, all of your software, everything that's associated with the system is included in that 89 cents, 90 cents per endpoint. So, like I say, the nice thing, at least in the city's case, there's not any infrastructure that you have to maintain. You mainly just have your software. You can use your existing computers. They provide the software and the tech support and everything you need to maintain your system. One of the other things that to be aware of is the battery life on these. They have a 10-year replacement warranty, meaning if the battery goes out in the first 10 years, they'll replace it. From 10 to 20 years, it's a prorated warranty. And so depending on how long it lasts from that 10 to 20 years, they'll replace it, but there is a cost associated with it based on a prorated amount. One of the things to be aware of is that you don't have to specifically say, hey, I'm going to do a radio read system or just a fixed base or just a cellular. There are hybrid systems that can be installed where you have a little bit of each, and so that is an option if a city were to desire to do something like that. You don't have to just do all one type. There's ways to do kind of a combination of several different types, and so that might be important if you wanted to kind of stagger the installation of the cellular reads over several years. You can install some, kind of have a hybrid system until you get them all switched over. So it's something to be aware of. So I wanted to move on and talk about, let's see here. I wanted to talk about this app. So for Badger Meter, they call it Ion Water, but essentially this is when you log on to your particular system, you'd have the name of the utility company up here. If there's a potential leak, that would show up here at a glance. How much water have you been using in the last several days. Also here, you can look at your meter, how frequently it's sending in data. Anyway, it has a lot of information in here, when it's going to update next. And then here you have this. I like this one because you can actually see your water use over the last several days. And I think you can change how often you want to look at this, but you can overlay it with the temperature. You can compare your water used from this year to last year. You can look and see what the precipitation was over that time period. And these are all general. I don't know how accurate they are per se, but it has your high and low temperatures. And so, if you look at, it says example, if you looked at September this year, and it was much hotter and drier than the year before. And so if your water use is up from last year, and you see that temperature, you're like, okay, that makes sense. Anyway, it just kind of helps you do some, analytics on your own system, both on an individual basis and also collectively. You can also look collectively at all of the meters and say, okay, how much water are we using per day? Combining all of the users in town, and so that's nice to be able to do some analytics on your system and kind of look at some trends and why are we using so much water? Is there ways to conserve? One of the really neat things is this leak detect. One of the city employees was talking to me about a month or two ago, and he made a point to stop by my office and say, hey, that Ion Water app is awesome. He got a notice that maybe he had a leak. He went through and checked all of his fixtures in his house, and he didn't see any noticeable leaks, but it was still showing that water was being used. And so he went out and kind of started digging around the meter, and sure enough, on the downstream side of the meter, there was a little leak, and his grass was just kind of starting to get wet in that area. So he's able to fix that leak within 4 days of knowing that there was a leak there, as opposed to waiting till you got a bill in the mail where that thing had been leaking for a month, and then it's costing your user money to have to pay for that water that's just going in the ground, not doing anything. And so I thought that was a pretty neat example of how this thing can be helpful. Also, with regard to water use disputes, one example, about a year ago, one of the users in the system had called the city and said, hey, it was kind of a newer subdivision. There was some she had water in her crawl space, and she's like, yeah, I think the groundwater's come up, and I'm getting flooded out here. And so we went out and looked at it, and sure enough, she had water all over the place, and her lawn was even wet. Water was subbing up, it appeared. And so, but hers was the only house in the area. I mean, the two neighbors on both sides had a little bit, but for the most part, it was just her house. And so we were like, man, we should take a look and see how much water she's using. And looking at it, I mean, her sprinklers are running almost all night and putting thousands of gallons of water onto her lawn. And so it actually ended up being an overwatering issue. And so we were able to work with her and readjust her sprinkler system so that it wasn't putting out so much water. She was happy when it was all said and done, because obviously her water bill went down and she wasn't getting that water in her basement anymore. So I thought that was a good example of how this system can not only help the city from a reduction in water conservation standpoint, but also for individual landowners being able to monitor their water use. So there's a couple of examples. Went through that pretty quick, but the last thing I wanted to talk about is just there's some newer technology that's come out here lately that I thought would be worth mentioning. With some of these the cellular read, they are able to track the pressure at the water meter. And so from if you have a water model set up for your city, if you could strategically place some of those meters throughout your system and get some almost real-time pressure data, then you could really hone in on your water model and really calibrate that thing so that it's as accurate as possible. So that's kind of new. I was really excited to hear about that. Also, the temperature of the water. They have some of the newer technology allows you to see what the temperature of that water is. One of the other ones that the city of Hermiston in particular is excited about is they have a remote on-off option on some of their newer meters. So if someone's not paying their bill and they have to get their water shut off, they don't have to send somebody out, find the meter, and turn it off. But they can actually do that from a remote location. Some of them now have they're sending out they actually have a GPS module in them where it's, you can actually see exactly where that thing is from a GIS standpoint. The other thing is, instead of sending out a signal, one time per day, you can actually send out, it's gathering data every 15 minutes, but it's only sending it once a day. With the newer technology, it's sending it out 4 times a day. So you're really getting up to date in the most recent water use data. Obviously, the battery life comes into play when you're sending out a signal that often. So that's something to be cognizant of. You may not want to send it out 4 times a day because it's running that battery down quicker, which means a quicker battery replacement cost. But overall, just from the standpoint of your analytics, by having some of this more up-to-date data, you're able to analyze your system and really kind of hone in on what your system's doing. The city of Hermiston's looking at putting water meters on their production wells, and this will be super helpful from the standpoint of doing water audits. They'll be able to see how much is being produced versus how much is being used in the system, which should make their doing a water audit fairly simple, and so they're excited about that. So that's about all I had at this point, and I appreciate you listening in, and if you have any questions, I believe that they'll have our contact information available. Be glad to talk to you about any of the things that I've discussed today, and I appreciate your time, and hope you have a great rest of your conference.